Hey there, Cryptid family. If you enjoy the chills, don't forget to like this video, subscribe if you're new, and hit that notification bell if you're not afraid of the whispers. It started with a howl, low and mournful. It rolled over the quiet town like thunder on a distant horizon. I still hear it in my nightmares, that sound and the screams that followed. Before the world ended, I was a paramedic, not a hero, not a soldier, just a guy trying to get by, patching people up and saving lives where I could. That all ended the night the howls began. It was supposed to be a normal evening. My wife Sarah was finishing dinner while our son Caleb played with his action figures on the living room floor. The smell of spaghetti and garlic bread filled the air, warm and comforting. For a moment it felt like nothing could go wrong. Then the call came in. I answered the radio clipped to my belt, listening to dispatch with half an ear. Something about a disturbance on the other side of town. My partner Zach was already on his way to pick me up. I grabbed my bag, kissed Sarah on the cheek, and ruffled Caleb's hair. "Be good for your mom," I said, smiling. He grinned back at me, his front teeth missing, and I remember thinking how much I loved that kid. Zach pulled up in the ambulance, his usual smirk replaced by a grim expression. "You hear about this call?" he asked as I climbed in. "No," I said, shutting the door. "What's going on?" "Some kind of animal attack. 3 dead already. Sheriff's department called it in." My stomach churned. "An animal? Like a bear?" Zach shook his head. "That's what I thought at first, but the sheriff said the wounds don't make sense. Said it looks like something tore through them with claws the size of steak knives." I didn't respond. My gut told me this wasn't normal. And when we arrived at the scene, I knew I was right. The house was a mess. Blood soaked the walls and pooled on the floor. The victims, 2 adults and a teenager, were barely recognizable. What was left of them had been shredded, as though some massive predator had torn them apart. Zach covered his mouth, gagging. I forced myself to look closer to figure out what the hell had done this. The claw marks were too deep for a dog, too wide for a cat. And the bites. Deep growling started, low, guttural, and too close for comfort. I turned toward the sound just as something moved in the shadows, a blur of fur and fangs. It charged. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Zach by the arm and dragging him toward the ambulance. We barely made it outside before the thing slammed into the door behind us, denting the metal. Zach scrambled into the driver's seat and I jumped into the passenger side. "Go!" I shouted, and Zach hit the gas. The tires squealed, and the creature gave chase, its glowing amber eyes locked on us. It moved like nothing I'd ever seen. Fast, powerful, relentless. Even in the rearview mirror, it looked like death itself. We managed to lose it, but that was just the beginning. When I got back home, I knew something was wrong. The front door was wide open, hanging on its hinges. Inside, the lights were flickering, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. "Sarah?" I called out, stepping inside. "Caleb?" No answer, just silence. Then I saw the blood. It was smeared across the floor, leading into the living room. My heart pounded as I followed the trail, dread tightening around my chest like a vice. I found them there, my wife and son. Sarah was crumpled on the floor, her throat torn out, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Caleb. God, Caleb. He was still clutching his action figure. Something growled behind me. I turned slowly, my whole body shaking. The thing that had killed them was still there, crouched in the shadows. Its matted fur glistened with blood, its teeth bared in a twisted grin. It wasn't just an animal. It wasn't human either. It was something worse. It lunged. I threw myself to the side, grabbing a kitchen knife off the counter as it barreled past me. It turned, its glowing eyes locking onto mine, and charged again. This time, I was ready. The knife sank into its chest, but it didn't stop. Somehow, I managed to push it off and stumble outside. I didn't stop running until I collapsed in the middle of the street, covered in blood, some mine, some not. By the time Zach found me, the creature was gone. The days that followed were chaos. The howls spread across the country, and with them came death. The infection moved faster than anyone could track, turning victims into monsters within hours. Cities burned, governments fell, and humanity scattered like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Now I'm just another survivor. My family is gone. My home is gone. And the world I knew is gone. All that's left is the fight to stay alive. And the howls, they never stop. I'd always thought survival was about being strong, fast, clever. Turns out it's none of those things. It's about staying quiet, invisible. The only way to survive out here is to pretend you don't exist. We were still miles away from the bunker, if it even existed, and the night was closing in fast. The sky turned a bruised shade of purple, the last rays of sunlight sinking below the horizon. That was when the howls started. It had been 3 days since I lost Sarah and Caleb. 3 days since I'd stumbled into this group of strangers. 2 days to care if they turned me away. Now I was stuck with them, an exhausted biologist, a cocky scavenger, and a kid who looked like she hadn't slept since the world ended. Not exactly my dream team. "Eli," Ivy said, her voice low, "we need to stop. The sun's almost gone." I nodded, though I wasn't sure stopping was a good idea. Night was when they came out. When the real monsters hunted. We needed shelter, somewhere we could hide until morning. Up ahead, the broken silhouette of a gas station rose from the ruins of the highway. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The gas station stank of mildew and rot, the smell so thick I could taste it. The walls were cracked, the shelves ransacked, but at least it had a roof. That was more than we'd had the last few nights. Mason stepped in first, his shotgun resting lazily on his shoulder. "Home sweet home," he muttered, kicking an empty can across the floor. The noise echoed, too loud in the oppressive silence. "Quiet," Ivy snapped, shooting him a glare. "Do you want them to find us?" "Relax," he said, leaning against the counter. "Place is empty." I wasn't so sure. My hand tightened around the knife at my belt as I scanned the room. Every dark corner felt like it was hiding something. Every creak of the floorboards made my skin crawl. "Check for supplies," I said, trying to sound like I had a plan. "Food, water, anything, and keep it down." Claire stuck close to Ivy, her wide eyes darting to every shadow. She hadn't spoken much since we found her. I didn't blame her. I didn't want to talk about what happened to my family either. We'd just started rummaging through the shelves when the first growl came. Low and guttural, it sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, my hands tightening on a dusty can of soup. Mason's cocky grin faltered. "Tell me that was your stomach," he whispered. "Shut up," I hissed. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against concrete. "They're here," Ivy said, her voice barely audible. "Out the back," I whispered, motioning toward the storage room. "Now." We moved slowly, every step agonizingly loud in the stillness. My heart pounded in my ears as we crept past the shattered windows. the darkness outside feeling alive. A faint rustle made me glance out of the corner of my eye and my stomach dropped. They were out there. At first I saw only shadows, darting between the ruins of old cars. But then, one stepped into the faint moonlight, its elongated body low to the ground, its glowing amber eyes scanning the station. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't alone. Two more appeared behind it, moving with predatory precision, their claws clicking softly against the pavement. We slipped into the storage room, shutting the door as quietly as we could. The space was cramped and dark, the air thick with the stench of oil and decay. Claire whimpered, and Ivy hushed her, wrapping an arm around the girl. "What now?" Mason whispered. Even his voice, normally full of bravado, was tight with fear. "We wait," I said. "Stay quiet. Stay still." For a moment it felt like maybe we'd made it. The growling outside faded, replaced by the distant hum of the wind. Then a sharp crack echoed through the station, a glass bottle shattering on the floor. They heard it. The growls returned louder and closer. The sound of claws scraping against the wall sent a wave of panic through me. One of them let out a snarl, and then came the sound of heavy footsteps circling the building. They were looking for us. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight. I didn't dare move. Ivy held Claire close, whispering soft reassurances into her ear. Mason gripped his shotgun, his knuckles white. None of us spoke. None of us even blinked. The first thud came from the main room, a deliberate testing sound. My pulse quickened. Another thud, closer this time. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. A claw scraped against the storage room door. Slowly, deliberately, I held my breath, my hand shaking as I reached for my knife. Not that it would do much against them. The door creaked, the handle rattling as the thing on the other side tested it. For a second, I thought it would come bursting through, but then it stopped. Silence fell again, heavier than before. I didn't move, afraid the smallest sound would bring them back. The growling faded, replaced by the soft rustle of movement outside. Ivy met my gaze, her eyes wide with fear. I nodded, signaling for her to stay put. I crept to the door, pressing my ear against it. The silence stretched on, unbearably long, until a howl tore through the night, chilling and guttural. More joined it, a chorus of predators on the hunt. But they weren't here anymore. They were moving on, heading down the highway. "They're gone," I whispered, my voice shaking. Mason let out a shaky breath, leaning against the wall. That was too close. "Yeah," I said, my legs trembling beneath me. "We need to move before they come back." We left the gas station just before dawn, slipping into the forest to avoid the open road. None of us spoke as we walked, the memory of those glowing eyes and scraping claws still fresh in our minds. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't a soldier or a fighter. Hell, I wasn't even a leader. But somehow, I was still alive. And as long as I kept moving, as long as I stayed quiet, maybe I could stay that way. Maybe. Dawn barely made a difference anymore. Even when the sun came up, the light felt thin, washed out, like the world was forgetting what it meant to be alive. The forest was no sanctuary either. It was cold, damp, and filled with shadows that seemed to breathe. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my heart skip a beat. We had been walking for hours, heading west, deeper into the wilderness. The trees offered cover from prying eyes, but that didn't make me feel safer. If anything, it made it worse. Out here, we were blind to what was hunting us. Can we stop? Claire asked, her voice small. She was lagging behind, her arms crossed tight against the chill. I'm tired. Ivy glanced at me, her face drawn and pale. She looked as exhausted as the rest of us, but she didn't say anything. I sighed, running a hand through my sweat-matted hair. 5 minutes, I said. No more. We found a small clearing and huddled together near a fallen tree. Ivy pulled a granola bar from her bag and handed it to Claire, who tore into it like it was the first meal she'd had in days. Mason leaned against the tree trunk, his shotgun propped up beside him. Not much of a plan, is it? Mason said, breaking the silence. Just wandering through the woods, hoping we don't get ripped to shreds. You have a better idea? I shot back, my tone sharper than I intended. Because if you do, I'd love to hear it. Yeah, he said with a smirk. How about we find a place to hole up, wait this shit out instead of walking into God knows what? And starve to death while we hide? Ivy asked, her voice quiet but cutting. Great plan, Mason. Very practical. He shrugged, unbothered. Better than wandering around until we walk into a pack. The argument was cut short by a noise in the distance, a low, mournful howl that made the hair on my arm stand up. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I saw Ivy's expression tighten as she glanced toward the sound. They're still tracking us, she said. They don't give up. No shit, Mason muttered. He grabbed his shotgun, his cocky demeanor slipping just enough to show the cracks underneath. How much further to this bunker of yours, Ivy? She pulled out her battered map, tracing her finger over the faded lines. If this is right, and I'm not sure it is, it's another 20 miles west. 20 miles? Mason scoffed. We'll be lucky to make it another 20 minutes. We don't have a choice, I said, standing. If there's even a chance this bunker is real, we have to keep moving. Ivy folded the map and tucked it away, nodding. Eli's right. We can't stop now. Claire's face crumpled, her exhaustion clear in every inch of her small frame. I don't think I can go that far, she whispered, and I'm so tired. I knelt down in front of her, trying to keep my voice steady. I know, Claire, but we have to. If we stop, they'll find us. You've been so strong already. Just a little further, okay? She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve. It didn't make me feel any better. We pushed on, the forest growing darker as the day dragged on. The trees loomed overhead, their bare branches twisting like skeletal hands. The howls came more frequently now, each one closer than the last. My grip on the knife at my belt tightened with every step. Keep quiet, I whispered as we crept along a narrow deer trail. The forest seemed alive, every sound amplified. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the snap of a twig. It felt like the trees themselves were watching us. Then I saw it, a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Ivy stopped behind me, her hand gripping Claire's shoulder. What is it? She whispered. Something's out there, I said, barely moving my lips. I scanned the tree line, searching for the source of the movement. My stomach dropped when I saw them. 2 werewolves, low to the ground, their glowing eyes locked onto us. Shit, Mason muttered. He raised his shotgun, but I grabbed his arm. No, I hissed. There's more. Look. Another shape emerged from the shadows, then another. They were fanning out, circling us like predators stalking prey. My hands started to shake, the knife feeling useless in my grip. We have to go, Ivy whispered. Now. Slow, I said, forcing myself to stay calm. Stay together. Don't run. We moved as quietly as we could, every step a gamble. The werewolves didn't charge. They just watched, their low growls sending shivers down my spine. It was like they were waiting for something. Why aren't they attacking? Claire whispered, her voice trembling. They're hurting us, Ivy said grimly, trying to push us where they want us. That thought terrified me more than anything else. These things weren't just animals. They were smart. Too smart. The trail narrowed as we reached a steep hill, the ground uneven and covered in loose rocks. Ivy slipped, grabbing onto me for balance, and the noise drew a sharp growl from one of the werewolves. My pulse spiked as its glowing eyes focused on us. Keep going, I whispered, pulling her along. Don't stop. Mason was breathing hard, his shotgun at the ready, but he didn't fire. Even he knew it would be suicide. The werewolves followed us, keeping their distance, but never letting up. Every second felt like an eternity. The tension coiled so tight I thought I might snap. Finally, we reached the top of the hill, and I saw it. A narrow ravine cutting through the forest. There was a fallen tree spanning the gap, its trunk slick with moss and damp from the mist clinging to the air. We cross, I said, one at a time. You've got to be kidding me, Mason said, staring at the tree. We'll break our necks. You'd rather stay here? I shot back, glancing at the werewolves stalking closer. That shut him up. Ivy went first, carefully balancing as she edged across the log. Claire followed, her small hands gripping the bark like her life depended on it. Mason grumbled under his breath, but crossed without incident. I was the last to go. Halfway across, the log shifted beneath me, and I froze, my arms outstretched for balance. That's when one of the werewolves lunged. It slammed into the base of the tree, its claws tearing into the wood. I nearly lost my footing, barely managing to scramble to the other side as the log gave way, crashing into the ravine below. The werewolves let out furious howls, pacing along the edge, their glowing eyes burning into us. We didn't stop to catch our breath. We ran, the howls fading behind us as the forest swallowed us whole. The first howl sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't close, but it didn't need to be. The sound carried over the forest like a storm warning, low and guttural, promising destruction. The others froze, their faces pale as ash. They're coming, Ivy whispered. Her voice was trembling, and she clutched Claire's arm like the girl might vanish if she let go. How many? Mason asked, though he already knew the answer. His eyes darted to the treetops, then the distant horizon. He gripped his shotgun tightly, but for once he didn't look cocky. He looked scared. All of them, Ivy said, barely above a whisper. We'd been moving west for days, skirting towns and highways, avoiding the places where the werewolves prowled. But now, it didn't matter. They were everywhere. The howls rose one by one, spreading like wildfire until they were all around us, a deafening symphony of death. My stomach twisted into knots. Keep moving, I said, trying to sound calm. I wasn't. Find cover. Now. The forest suddenly felt suffocating, the trees too sparse to hide us. The shadows seemed alive, twisting and shifting as if something was waiting just out of sight. Every step felt like it could be our last. Claire whimpered, her small hand clutching Ivy's. Are they going to find us? She asked, her voice trembling. No, Ivy lied. We won't let them. I wanted to believe her, but the truth was, I didn't know if we could stop them. Not this many. The first glimpse of the horde came when we crested a hill overlooking a stretch of open farmland. The moon was high, casting its pale light over the fields, and there they were, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. The werewolves moved as one, a sea of fur and muscle that stretched as far as I could see. Their glowing amber eyes lit up the darkness like fireflies, their howls blending into a guttural, unholy roar. Some ran on all fours, others on two legs, their movements fluid and predatory. They were tearing through everything in their path, trees, fences, anything that stood in their way. I stood frozen, unable to breathe. The scale of it was unimaginable. I'd thought the world was ending before, but this was the nail in the coffin. There was no fighting this, no surviving it. Mason let out a low whistle. "Holy shit," he said, his voice barely audible. "We're dead. We're so fucking dead." "Shut up," I snapped, though I couldn't blame him. My hands were shaking, my legs weak. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the nightmare below us. "They're heading this way," Ivy said, her tone sharp with panic. "We need to move." "Move where?" Mason hissed. "Look at them. They'll sniff us out in minutes." "We hide," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "There's no other choice." We scrambled down the hill, staying low, our movements frantic but quiet. The forest offered some cover, but not enough. Every twig that snapped underfoot felt like a death sentence. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they could hear it. Ahead, Ivy spotted an old hunting cabin nestled among the trees. It was barely more than a shack, its walls warped and sagging, but it was better than nothing. "In there," she said, pushing Claire forward. "Hurry." We piled inside, the small space reeking of damp wood and mildew. Mason shoved a dusty table against the door, as if that would stop them. Ivy pulled Claire into a corner, holding her close. I stood by the window, peering through a crack in the warped wood. They were getting closer. The ground seemed to vibrate with their approach, the sound of their snarls and growls growing louder. Shadows moved between the trees, flickering in and out of the moonlight. The horde was spilling into the forest, an unstoppable wave of death. "Keep quiet," I whispered, though no one needed the reminder. We barely breathed as the werewolves came closer, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness like searchlights. One of them passed just feet from the cabin, its massive body rippling with muscle. Its claws scraped against the bark of a tree, leaving deep gouges. It stopped, sniffing the air, and my blood ran cold. I held my breath, my whole body frozen. It moved on. I let out a shaky exhale, but the relief was short-lived. More of them followed, dozens at first, then hundreds. They swarmed through the forest, their movements coordinated and deliberate. They weren't just hunting, they were searching. For us. The cabin groaned under the weight of the horde's presence. One of the werewolves brushed against the wall, its claws raking across the wood. The sound was deafening in the silence. My grip on the knife at my belt tightened, though I knew it wouldn't save me. Mason was crouched by the door, his shotgun resting in his lap. He didn't look cocky anymore. He looked like a man praying to a god that had already abandoned him. The minutes dragged on like hours as the horde passed. Every second felt like an eternity. The tension coiled so tight I thought I might snap. The air inside the cabin was suffocating, thick with the stench of fear and sweat. Then came the worst sound of all, a howl, louder and deeper than the others. It wasn't just a signal, it was a call. A command, the alpha. The werewolves' movements changed immediately. They spread out, their glowing eyes scanning every shadow, every crevice. One of them stopped near the cabin, its nose twitching. My stomach dropped as it turned toward us, its head tilting slightly. It knew. Ivy clamped a hand over Claire's mouth, stifling the small whimper that escaped. Mason raised his shotgun, but I grabbed his arm, shaking my head. If he fired, it'd be over. The werewolf sniffed again, its claws tapping against the ground as it moved closer. My chest tightened. My breath caught in my throat. It stopped just outside the window, its glowing eyes peering in through the cracks. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Time seemed to stop. Then, as if by some miracle, it turned away. A howl from deeper in the forest drew its attention, and it bounded off into the darkness. I slumped against the wall, my whole body trembling. The horde moved on, their snarls fading into the distance. But the relief was fleeting. The alpha was still out there. And it wasn't going to stop until it found us. The forest was dead silent after the horde passed, but the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like the kind you find before a storm, a calm so heavy it's suffocating. We didn't move for what felt like hours, too afraid that any noise might bring them back. It was Claire who broke the stillness first, her small voice trembling. "Are they gone?" Ivy looked at me, her face pale and streaked with sweat. I didn't answer right away, pressing my ear against the warped wood of the cabin wall. The growls, the howls, the pounding footsteps, they were gone. But that didn't mean we were safe. For now, I finally whispered, "But we need to move." The air outside felt colder than it should have, the kind of cold that bites right through your skin and settles in your bones. The moon hung high above the treetops, pale and uncaring, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Every step we took felt like a gamble, every rustle of leaves underfoot a threat. "No one makes a sound," I said, my voice barely audible. We moved fast and quiet. Mason was unusually silent as we trudged through the woods, his usual sarcasm replaced by grim determination. Claire clung to Ivy's hand, her face hidden behind a tangled curtain of hair. Ivy kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes wide and searching the darkness. I couldn't tell if she was looking for werewolves or just hoping we'd made it out. Neither of us said what we were all thinking. It wasn't over. The alpha's howl still lingered in my ears, a low, guttural command that felt more like a promise. They would find us. It was just a matter of when. The forest thinned as we pressed on, the trees giving way to rolling hills dotted with the remains of abandoned houses. Most of them were little more than skeletons, their roofs caved in and their walls blackened by fire. One stood out, a farmhouse sitting at the edge of a hill, its windows intact, its structure still standing. "We could rest there," Ivy said, nodding toward it. Her voice was hesitant, like she didn't believe it herself. "It's exposed," Mason said, frowning. "They'd see us coming a mile away." "They already know we're out here," I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "Unless you have a better idea, we're going." He didn't argue, which worried me more than his usual sarcasm. The farmhouse was eerily quiet as we approached. The door creaked on its hinges, the sound too loud in the oppressive silence. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. Broken furniture was scattered across the floor, and the walls were streaked with dark stains that I didn't want to think about. "We'll stay here until morning," I said, setting my pack down near the door. Just long enough to rest. Ivy nodded, already pulling Claire toward a corner where they could huddle together. Mason moved to the window, peering out into the darkness with his shotgun resting against his shoulder. I found myself pacing the room, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. The farmhouse felt wrong, like it had seen its share of horrors. It wasn't hard to imagine what had happened here. Whoever lived here hadn't made it. I was halfway through checking the second room when I heard it, a sound so faint I almost thought I imagined it, a soft scraping noise like claws against wood. My stomach twisted as I froze, straining to listen. It came again, louder this time, from outside. "Eli," Ivy called softly, her voice tight with fear. "They're here." Mason swore under his breath, moving to barricade the door with what little furniture we could find. I peeked through the window, my heart sinking as I saw them. The werewolves were emerging from the shadows, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. There weren't hundreds this time, but there were still too many, enough to tear the farmhouse apart in seconds. "They know we're here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do?" Ivy asked, pulling Claire closer. The girl was trembling, her face buried against Ivy's side. I hesitated, my mind racing. Running wasn't an option, not with them surrounding us. Fighting was suicide. That left only one choice. "We hide," I said. "Upstairs. Now." The second floor was little more than an attic, its walls slanted and covered in cobwebs. There was barely enough room to stand, but it was better than being downstairs. Mason helped me pull a dresser in front of the narrow staircase, though we both knew it wouldn't stop them for long. Ivy and Claire crouched in the farthest corner, their backs pressed against the wall. Mason sat by the staircase, his shotgun resting across his knees. I took the spot by the window, peeking through a crack in the warped wood. The werewolves were moving closer, their massive bodies blending into the shadows. One of them stopped near the front door, sniffing the air. Its claws scraped against the wood, sending shivers down my spine. Another one circled the house, its glowing eyes scanning the windows. "They're checking every inch," I whispered. "They won't stop until they find us." Mason let out a shaky breath. "Then what the hell are we supposed to do?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. The minutes dragged on like hours as the werewolves searched the house. Every creak of the floorboards, every scratch against the walls made my heart race. Ivy was whispering something to Claire, her voice soft and soothing, though I couldn't make out the words. Mason kept his shotgun trained on the staircase, his finger hovering over the trigger. Then came the sound we'd been dreading, the front door crashing open. The werewolves were inside. My pulse spiked as their growls filled the air, low and guttural, vibrating through the floorboards. They moved through the house with terrifying precision, their claws tapping against the wood like a countdown. I could hear them sniffing, searching, getting closer. One of them slammed against the dresser at the base of the stairs, snarling. The sound made Claire cry out, and Ivy clamped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. The dresser shifted, the wood groaning under the werewolf's weight. It wouldn't hold for long. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. My hands shook as I gripped my knife, the blade feeling pitifully small in my grasp. Mason looked at me, his face pale but determined. "If they get through," he said quietly, "we don't stand a chance." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I know. The dresser shifted again, the werewolf's growls growing louder. Another one joined it, slamming against the barricade. The wood cracked, splinters raining down onto the floor. Then, just as the dresser was about to give way, a howl echoed in the distance. Not from the house, but far off, deep in the forest. The werewolves froze, their ears twitching. Another howl followed, louder this time, and the creatures turned toward the sound. They left, one by one. They retreated, their massive bodies slipping into the shadows. The house fell silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. They're gone, Mason said, his voice shaky. For now, Ivy whispered, holding Claire close. But they'll be back. We didn't talk much after the werewolves left. What was there to say? That we were lucky to still be alive? That luck didn't exist anymore? Only delays in the inevitable? The sun was just starting to rise when we left the farmhouse. The morning light stretched through the trees, painting the forest in shades of gold and gray. It might have been beautiful if it weren't for the blood dried on our clothes, the exhaustion etched into our faces, and the howls still echoing faintly in the distance. We can't keep doing this, Ivy said, her voice hoarse. She walked beside me, clutching her satchel like it was the only thing holding her together. Claire walked behind us, her steps dragging. She hadn't said a word since last night, her eyes distant, her hands clenched into fists. Mason brought up the rear, his shotgun slung over his shoulder. He hadn't cracked a joke since the farmhouse. That scared me more than the howls. By mid-afternoon, the forest began to thin, and the ground sloped downward. Ivy stopped, pulling out her map. She studied it for a moment, her brow furrowed, then looked up at the horizon. We're close, she said, pointing to a ridge in the distance. The bunker should be just beyond that. How sure are you? Mason asked, his tone sharp. Because if this is another wild goose chase, we're wasting time we don't have. Ivy glared at him. It's there, I'm sure. Good enough for me, I said, stepping forward. Let's move. The ridge was steeper than it looked, and by the time we reached the top, I was gasping for air, my legs trembling. But when I saw what was on the other side, my exhaustion melted away. There it was. The bunker was built into the side of a rocky hill, its entrance partially obscured by overgrown bushes and vines. The steel door was massive and rusted, with a faded military insignia barely visible beneath years of grime. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. We found it, Ivy whispered, a flicker of hope in her voice. Yeah, Mason said, his hand tightening on his shotgun. But what's waiting for us inside? The door groaned loudly as we forced it open, the sound echoing through the still air. The darkness inside was immediate and suffocating, swallowing the faint sunlight that managed to slip through the trees. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. The air was stale and cold, thick with the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. The walls were lined with peeling paint, the floor littered with debris, discarded papers, rusted tools, and broken glass. A long hallway stretched out in front of us, disappearing into the shadows. Stay close, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, and keep quiet. We moved slowly, the silence pressing down on us like a weight. Every step echoed, the sound unnerving in the emptiness. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though I knew it was impossible. The place was abandoned. Had to be. At least, that's what I told myself. The first room we entered was some kind of control center. Rows of consoles lined the walls, their screens shattered and covered in dust. Ivy immediately started sifting through the papers scattered across the floor, her hands trembling with excitement. "This is it," she said, her voice shaking. "This is where they studied the virus." "What virus?" Mason asked, leaning against the door frame. "You keep talking about it like it matters. All that matters is what's out there." "What's out there started here," Ivy snapped, holding up a faded document. "This wasn't an accident. They didn't stumble onto this. They created it." "What are you saying?" I asked, my throat dry. Ivy's hands trembled as she held up the paper, her eyes scanning the words. The military was experimenting with something, some kind of biological weapon. They were trying to create super soldiers, but it mutated. It got out of control. "Jesus," Mason muttered, running a hand through his hair. "You're telling me this whole apocalypse is because some assholes wanted a better army?" "It gets worse," Ivy said, her voice barely audible. "They didn't just create the virus. They created it." "It?" I asked, dreading the answer. "The Alpha," Ivy whispered. "They called it Sovereign. It wasn't just an accident. It was designed, engineered to lead." The words hung heavy in the air, suffocating. I felt like the walls were closing in, the weight of the revelation pressing down on me. The Alpha wasn't just some freak of nature. It was man-made, and it wasn't going to stop. We moved deeper into the bunker, the air growing colder and heavier. The next room we entered was worse, a lab. The tables were covered in shattered glass and rusted equipment, but the worst part was the cages. They lined the walls, their bars bent and broken, the metal stained with something dark and dried. I didn't want to think about what had been inside them. "Jesus Christ," Mason muttered, his voice trembling. "What the hell were they doing down here?" "Testing," Ivy said, her voice flat. "On animals first, then people." Claire whimpered, and Ivy pulled her closer, shielding her from the worst of it. I felt my stomach churn as I noticed a table in the corner, its surface covered in straps and claw marks. "We need to go," I said, my voice tight. "Now." "Wait," Ivy said, grabbing another document from the floor. Her eyes scanned the page, her brow furrowing. "There's a bioweapon. A failsafe." "What kind of failsafe?" Mason asked. "It's not clear," Ivy said, her voice hesitant. "But it requires the Alpha's blood. Direct access." "You're kidding me," Mason said, laughing bitterly. "You're telling me the only way to stop this thing is to get close enough to bleed it? That's suicide." "Do you have a better idea?" Ivy shot back. "Because if you do, I'm all ears." Mason didn't respond. None of us did. We left the bunker in silence, the weight of what we'd learned pressing down on us. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the hills. The howls began again, faint but growing louder. "It's not just survival anymore," I said, gripping my knife tighter. "It's about ending this." The sun had almost set by the time we left the bunker. The silence of the forest was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of our boots on dead leaves. None of us spoke. What was there to say? The bunker's revelations hung over us like a storm cloud. We'd come looking for answers, but all we'd found were more nightmares. Mason was the first to break the silence. "You really think that bioweapon will work?" he asked, slinging his shotgun over his shoulder. His voice was sharp, as if he didn't want to believe it. Ivy glanced back at him, her face pale and drawn. If we can get to the Alpha, yes, but that's a big if. If we can get to the Alpha, Mason repeated mockingly. You hear yourself? You're asking us to walk right into the jaws of the biggest monster out there. We don't have a choice, Ivy snapped. If we don't stop this thing, it's over. For everyone. It's already over, Mason muttered, kicking a rock off the trail. We're just too stupid to admit it. Enough, I said, my voice harsher than I intended. Save it. We have bigger problems. The howls started again, low and mournful, rising from the distance like the beginning of a terrible symphony. I felt a chill creep up my spine as the sound carried through the trees. They're close, Ivy whispered. She pulled Claire closer, her hand trembling, as she gripped the girl's arm. Too close. We pushed forward, moving faster now. The forest was a maze of gnarled branches and uneven ground, every shadow feeling like it was alive. My chest tightened with every step, the weight of dread pressing down on me. The howls were growing louder, and I knew it was only a matter of time. Eli, Mason called from behind me. We've got company. I turned, my heart dropping as I saw them. Shadows moved between the trees, their glowing amber eyes cutting through the darkness. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more, their bodies sleek and powerful as they stalked toward us. Run, I said, my voice barely audible. We bolted, the ground shifting beneath our feet as we tore through the forest. Branches whipped at my face, the air filled with the sound of snapping twigs and pounding footsteps. The werewolves gave chase, their snarls and growls growing louder with every second. One of them lunged out of the shadows, its claws raking through the air. I stumbled, barely managing to dodge as it crashed into a tree beside me. Mason fired his shotgun, the blast echoing through the forest. The creature went down, but two more appeared in its place. They're cutting us off, Ivy shouted, her voice frantic. They're trying to hurt us. No shit, Mason barked, firing again. The recoil sent him stumbling, but the shot found its mark, and another werewolf crumpled to the ground. Blood sprayed across the leaves, hot and metallic. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. We broke into a clearing, our breaths ragged and our legs burning. The werewolves were right behind us, their glowing eyes a wall of fire in the dark. I scanned the clearing, desperate for anything that could give us an advantage. There, I shouted, pointing to a cluster of boulders on the far side. We can use those for cover. We sprinted toward the rocks, the werewolves closing in. Ivy stumbled, and I grabbed her arm, pulling her forward as one of the creatures swiped at her back. Its claws missed by inches, tearing through her coat instead. She gasped, her face pale with fear. Keep going, I shouted, my voice raw. We reached the rocks just as the first werewolf lunged. Mason fired point blank, the blast ripping through the creature's chest. It howled, blood spraying across the ground. But the others were undeterred. They circled us, their snarls vibrating through the air. This is bad, Mason muttered, reloading his shotgun. This is so fucking bad. No arguments here, I said, gripping my knife tightly. It felt like a toothpick in my hand, useless against the monsters closing in. The first attack came without warning. A werewolf leapt onto the boulder I was crouched behind, its claws digging into the stone as it lunged at me. I rolled to the side, slashing wildly with my knife. The blade sliced through its arm and it howled in pain, but it didn't stop. It never stopped. Mason fired again, the shot hitting the creature in the head. It crumpled, its body twitching as blood pooled beneath it. Another werewolf lunged at him, its jaws snapping shut inches from his face. He swung his shotgun like a club, smashing it across the creature's snout. It snarled, rearing back for another attack. Ivy screamed as one of the werewolves lunged at her and Claire. She swung her satchel, the heavy bag slamming into its face, but it barely flinched. Its claws raked across her arm, drawing blood, and she stumbled back, clutching the wound. "Help!" she cried, her voice breaking. I charged, my knife plunging into the creature's side. It howled, thrashing wildly, and I barely managed to dodge its claws as it turned on me. Mason fired, the blast hitting it in the chest, and it collapsed in a heap. The clearing was chaos. Blood soaked the ground, the air thick with snarls and gunfire. For every werewolf we killed, 2 more seemed to take its place. My arms felt like lead, my breaths coming in ragged gasps, but I couldn't stop. Not if I wanted to live. "We can't hold them off," Ivy shouted, her voice hoarse. "We have to run." "Where?" Mason snapped, his shotgun empty. He threw it to the ground, grabbing a rock and hurling it at the nearest werewolf. It hit the creature in the head, but it only seemed to piss it off. "There." I pointed to a narrow path leading into the trees. It wasn't much, but it was the only option. "Go. Now." We bolted, leaving the clearing behind. The werewolves gave chase, their howls echoing through the night. My legs burned, my vision blurred, but I kept running. It was the only thing I could do. By the time we stopped, the werewolves were gone, their howls fading into the distance. We collapsed in a heap, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. Blood coated our clothes, our faces, our hands. It wasn't all ours. "Is everyone okay?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Ivy nodded, clutching Claire tightly. Mason didn't answer, his head in his hands. I looked at the others, my chest tightening. We were alive. But for how much longer? The Alpha was still out there, and now it felt closer than ever. The Alpha Sovereign's territory felt like walking into death itself. The trees were stripped bare, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. Bones littered the ground, animal and human alike. Some picked clean, others shattered, as if something had taken pleasure in their destruction. The air was heavy, suffocating, carrying the metallic stench of blood and decay. Every breath felt like a curse. "This is it," Ivy whispered. Her voice trembled, barely audible over the distant howls that reverberated through the wasteland. "We're here." I nodded, gripping the bioweapon tighter in my hands. The vial inside glimmered faintly, a fragile beacon of hope. A part of me wondered if it was a fool's hope. Mason had called it suicide, and I was starting to think he was right. Claire clung to Ivy's side, her wide eyes scanning the darkness. She hadn't spoken much since we entered the Alpha's domain. None of us had. What was there to say? That we'd made it this far? That we were about to die? Mason adjusted his shotgun, his hands shaking despite the bravado he tried to project. "So, what's the plan, fearless leader?" he asked, his voice tight with sarcasm. "You going to knock on its door and ask it politely to hold still while you stick it with that thing?" "If you have a better idea, I'm listening," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I was exhausted, my body running on fumes, but there was no turning back now. "Yeah," Mason muttered. "Didn't think so." We pushed forward, every step feeling heavier than the last. The howls grew louder, closer, echoing off the barren trees. I tightened my grip on the knife at my belt, knowing it was useless but needing to hold on to something. Anything. The Alpha's den came into view like something out of a nightmare. A massive, jagged rock formation jutted out of the earth, its surface streaked with blood and claw marks. The entrance was a yawning black void, the kind that made you think twice about stepping inside. "This is it," Ivy said again, her voice barely more than a whisper. She was clutching Claire's hand so tightly the girl winced. "Stay here," I said, my stomach churning at the thought of what I was about to do. "If this goes wrong—" "It won't," Ivy interrupted, her voice trembling but firm. "It can't." I wanted to believe her. I really did. The den was worse than I could have imagined. The walls were slick with some kind of viscous liquid, the air thick and stifling. Bones littered the floor, crunching under my boots with every step. My flashlight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. And then I saw it, the Alpha Sovereign. It stood in the center of the cavern, its massive frame illuminated by the faint glow of my flashlight. Its fur was black as midnight, matted with blood, its eyes burning like twin suns. Scars crisscrossed its body, a testament to countless battles. It wasn't just a predator, it was a king, and this was its throne. The Alpha turned its gaze toward me, its lips pulling back in a snarl that revealed rows of jagged teeth. It was intelligent, far more than any of the others. It knew why I was here. It knew what I was holding. And it wasn't going to let me leave alive. The Alpha moved faster than I thought possible, a blur of muscle and fury. I dove to the side, barely avoiding its claws as they tore through the air where I'd been standing. The ground shook as it landed, its growl rumbling like an earthquake. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the bioweapon like my life depended on it. Because it did. The Alpha charged again, and this time I wasn't fast enough. Its massive paw slammed into me, sending me crashing into the wall. Pain exploded in my ribs, and I gasped for air, the vial nearly slipping from my grasp. "Come on," I muttered to myself, forcing my legs to move. "Get up. Get up." The Alpha loomed over me, its breath hot and rancid. Its eyes burned with malice, but there was something else there too, curiosity. It was toying with me, savoring the moment. I gripped the vial tightly, my hand trembling as I pulled the syringe from my belt. This was it, my only chance. The Alpha lunged. I twisted at the last second, plunging the syringe into its side. The creature howled, the sound so loud it rattled the walls of the cavern. It stumbled back, its massive frame convulsing, as the bioweapon began to take effect. For a moment, I thought it had worked. The Alpha collapsed to the ground, its body writhing as the liquid coursed through its veins. But then its growls turned to something else, laughter, deep, guttural laughter that made my blood run cold. It wasn't dying, it was changing. The Alpha's body contorted, its limbs elongating, its fur bristling as new spikes of bone jutted from its back. Its eyes glowed brighter, burning with a feral intensity that was almost blinding. The bioweapon hadn't killed it. It had made it stronger. I staggered back, my mind racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. Ivy said it would work. She said. A deafening roar filled the cavern, and I realized it wasn't coming from the Alpha. It was coming from the horde. They'd come for their king. I ran. The sound of the horde echoed behind me, a tidal wave of snarls and growls that threatened to swallow me whole. I burst out of the cavern, gasping for air, and nearly collided with Ivy and Claire. "What happened?" Ivy asked, her voice frantic. "Did you—" "It didn't work," I said, cutting her off. "We need to go. Now." The ground trembled as the horde descended on the cavern. The Alpha's roar pierced the air, a challenge to anything foolish enough to stand in its way. We didn't wait to see what happened next. We ran, the forest blurring around us as the sounds of chaos faded into the distance. By the time we stopped, the sun was rising, casting the forest in an eerie red light. None of us spoke. Ivy held Claire close, her face pale and streaked with tears. Mason leaned against a tree. I sank to the ground, my body aching, my mind racing. The Alpha was still out there, and now it was worse than ever. A soft rustle caught my attention, and I looked up. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the morning light, was a wolf pup. Its fur was dark and matted, its amber eyes glowing faintly. It didn't snarl or growl. It just watched us. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't know what it meant, but one thing was clear. The apocalypse wasn't over. It was just beginning.